Good afternoon, everyone. My name is George Leaf. I'm the Director of Research at the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal, and I'd like to welcome all of you to our quarterly book discussion webinar. We host these book discussions with people who've written books about higher education every quarter. This, I think, is our fifth, and I don't know what our next one's going to be, but we'll follow our website and you'll find out. They're always good discussions. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the Martin Center, we are a nonprofit organization dedicated to higher education reform. We advocate responsible governance in our colleges and universities, something that's usually lacking. We advocate viewpoint diversity rather than the ideological monocultures we so often find. We like heightened standards in academic quality, greater cost effectiveness, and innovative market-based reforms. Now, our guest today is Jonathan Butcher. Jonathan is the Will Skillman Fellow in Educational Policy at the Heritage Foundation. He's going to be discussing his book, Splintered, Critical Race Theory and the Progressive War on Truth, which was published in April of this year by Bombardier Books. Now, the way we'll run this webinar is we'll turn things over to Jonathan, who will talk about the meat and potatoes of his book for about 20 minutes. And then I have a few questions which I'll toss at him. And then we'll open things up for questions from the audience, from you listeners. And you can post your questions at any time, which will show up on our computers, and we'll read them when we get to that point. So without delaying things any further, I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan Butcher. Jonathan, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, George. Thank you for having me. And thanks to the James G. Martin Center for hosting this discussion on my book. My book was meant to answer a question. And the question was, are those who are concerned about racial discrimination just making things up now? I mean, is this a figment of the imagination for parents, conservatives, and policymakers who see content in K-12 schools, who see public policies, who see events happening on college campuses that clearly demonstrate that people are being treated differently based on the color of their skin? And is this just something that conservatives are making up? Are we using this as some sort of dog whistle, or is it something that you know, it's just the next culture war that conservatives are trying to use to distract, you know, the rest of America from more important policies? And the answer is most clearly no. It is not an illusion. We're not just making this up. And it needed, I felt, to be documented that what has taken over our K-12 schools, particularly assigned schools, but not exclusively, right? Private schools, as I think we'll get to in a little bit, are also institutions that have begun to change their mission statements, change their teaching even. What is behind this, right? What is this critical race theory that has been making headlines over the past couple of years? And how does it show up in K-12 schools and in higher ed? Because one of the chapters in my book talks about how critical race theory and what we've known as the free speech crisis on college campuses are really one and the same, I would argue. So critical race theory is the child of what is known as critical theory, right? There were Marxists in Germany in the 1920s who were frustrated that the working class in Germany had not staged revolution in the same way that the Bolsheviks had been successful in Russia. They didn't care for the Soviets so much, and they say they didn't care for communism, but, you know, I think as those who have looked at, you know, socialism and Nazism and communism and tried to pull apart the differences will tell you that they're really few and far between, really. So these neo-Marxists believe that Marxism needed to be rejuvenated. And because Marxism, as we know, right, it's based on this struggle between economic classes, right? There's this perpetual power struggle between the working class and the bourgeoisie, between the worker and their employer. And the Frankfurt School, as they became known in Germany in the 1920s, moving into the 1930s, especially their director under their first director, Max Horkheimer, believed that this question of the struggle in society between the marginalized and the oppressors was more than just an economic question, right? This was more than just a class discussion. This had to do with cultural cultural imbalances that Marxism could help to explain. And so they developed what is known as critical theory. It's critical of traditional theory, right? Traditional theory is we can use reason, we can use science, we can improve our station in life by the choices that we make, by developing ideas. Critical theory is critical of that, right? And that's not essentially what the title came from, but it's close enough, right? One historian says critical theory is a gadfly of other philosophies, right? It is meant to criticize every other philosophy, essentially, or explanation of life, boiling down to this concept that there are a set of circumstances and oppressive ideas that the marginalized groups will always be struggling against, okay? So in 1937, these critical theorists were chased out of Germany by the Nazis. Oddly enough, this group of academics, the Frankfurt School, they were Jewish scholars, and they were chased out of Germany, landed at Columbia. And this is when things really got interesting, because here is where some of them, stayed in New York, some of them went to California, and they began to teach a whole generation of students and scholars and academics about this rejuvenated concept of Marxism. So we're going to speed things up here, right? Critical legal theorists were the legal scholars who adopted this neo-Marxian view. And they said, in the context of American law, this means that American law is systemically oppressive. Fast forward to the 1980s, late 1980s, and you have Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, Richard Delgado, all legal scholars, all law professors, who said, look, the critical legal theorists and the liberals in the 1960s and 70s who were dealing in the civil rights space, they were close, they got some of it right, but we're going to take it one step further, and we're going to say that this oppressive culture in which America has created and the systemic oppression, it is the result of a racial conflict that is embedded in the United States. Look, Derek Bell's book, Faces at the Bottom of the Well, has a subtitle that says The Permanence of Racism, right? I mean, this was a core concept that the critical race theorists drew out of critical legal theory. Okay, so now we've taken a few minutes to do about 100 years, I think, of neo-Marxian philosophy. And this is why just last week, right, 10 days ago, when the Minnesota Teacher Union and Minneapolis, right? Minneapolis, the teacher union in Minneapolis, and their contract was exposed by the mainstream, by the media, by Fox News and others, and an element said that white teachers would be fired before Black teachers, irregardless of seniority. This is why it's an issue today, right? You have these examples of, especially in the K-12 world, but not exclusively, of individuals, both teachers and students, being treated differently just based on the color of their skin, right? We are hearkening back to a very dark era prior to the civil rights movement. We're hearkening back to a set of ideas that I had hoped, and in the writing of my book, that those such as, the book American Dilemma, and others who were writing about how racial discrimination was incompatible with the American experiment, we hoped we had left behind us. But clearly it is, without question, in classrooms today. And so there are, chapters in my book, chapters 2 and chapters 3 especially, will walk through, what are the examples? And look, they're legion. And the fascinating thing is that they often don't hide the words critical race theory, which is amazing when, Randy Weingarten, the head of the AFT, will get up and say, oh, critical race theory is not, not found in schools. Or others, those in Democrats in Congress may say, well, critical race theory is not in schools. Well, the school district right across the bay from San Francisco, the Haywood Unified School District, sent a memo to their school community That said, they would make sure critical race theory remained in classrooms as part of the state's ethnic studies curriculum. California's ethnic studies curriculum has an entire section, an entire chapter on intersectionality, which is the element of critical race theory developed by Kimberly Crenshaw. You have in Virginia, in Loudoun County, which the Washington Post called the center of the culture war, right, today, a teacher training program that used the words in the PowerPoint, critical race theory. You have in Portland Public Schools, there are videos on YouTube that is of a critical race theory working group, and on, right? Detroit just recently, in fact, more recently, I would say, than some of these, or just going back to last fall, right? So not in the past couple of weeks, but just a few months ago, the superintendent of Detroit Public Schools is on a video on YouTube saying that critical race theory is most certainly in the school curriculum and used. So these are the truths, I think, that are being kept from the American public and from parents and even from educators when you have sort of the elite, right? The education establishment elite saying that critical race theory is not in schools. So what is this producing, right? What does critical race theory have in it that is so threatening and is so fearful? Well, for one, there is this idea that no policy and no individual can be colorblind. Critical race theory is completely rejects the idea that color blindness is possible in either public policy or culture. And that means that you must construct public policies and you must construct cultural mores that create equal outcomes for individuals, regardless of their personal choices. So it doesn't matter the choices that you make for your life. It is the responsibility of government to create the same outcomes, which can only be done by totalitarian means, right? You can only do that by taking rights from some people and giving other people advantages, right? I mean, that is a key essence of critical race theory. The other is that there is a rejection of the civil rights movement. Derek Bell and Richard Delgado in particular have this concept called interest convergence, where they argued that the only reason that there was any progress on civil rights in the US in the 60s and 70s is because those in power, right, the group in power, white males in particular, believed that it was in their interest, that it preserved their power for some civil rights to be allowed, right? It's a very cynical view of the American experience. And once you reject the civil rights laws, right, once you reject civil rights as a concept, then it opens up this cauldron, I think, of racist behaviors that is approved and condoned by critical race theorists, right? So Evanston, Illinois, there's a lawsuit ongoing now of a teacher who saw that there were mandatory affinity groups being used in public schools. Wellesley, Massachusetts just recently settled with the group Parents Defending Education, a great advocacy group defending parents. They settled a lawsuit because Parents Defending Ed said that Wellesley was, in fact, using mandatory racial affinity groups, separating students by color. And Wellesley settled, and I would argue, because they knew it wouldn't stand up in court. I mean, once you hold that up to the Civil Rights Act, you can't defend it, right? They don't have grounds to stand on. All right, so in just these last few minutes, and then I'm happy to answer questions that George, you have, or the audience may have. So where does this fit in with higher education, right? Where does higher ed come into the picture, and why did I write a chapter about it? Well, in 2017, when I was very pleased to be working with the Goldwater Institute, and we developed some model legislation to protect free speech on college campuses, we were looking at these events happening at Cal Berkeley and at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and at Evergreen State, and all of these examples that we were saying were evidence of a free speech crisis on campus. Yes, they were and are evidence of a free speech crisis, but it's remarkable to note that the individual who spoke at Evergreen State College just before the meltdown that their campus experienced with Brett Weinstein was Robin DiAngelo, the contemporary critical race theorist who wrote White Fragility, right? And I think it is it's not just a coincidence that this mindset victimization and of critical race theory's belief that everything must be seen through the lens of racism had taken root on campus. And you can trace these examples throughout the free speech crisis and see behind them that there are demands for discriminatory actions and policies. So take, for example, in 2015, there were some 80 universities where student groups, sometimes joined by faculty, wrote letters to administrators saying more faculty of color must be hired. Again, no mention of competency or quality or the ability to produce successful outcomes. It's merely a ratio that must be abided by. At the University of Arizona, they had a big campus-wide discussion after some students shouted down Border Patrol officers, hurled racial epithets at them, and they had this big campus discussion where students got up to try to defend this idea that they are being oppressed, right? And it's remarkable at institutions that have quite the sticker price, right? That parents are sending them off to, that they're paying $60,000 a year for their children to be oppressed at school. And here is where you can leave it to higher education, where it quickly ventures into the absurd. You have some colleges where students would demand free laundry detergent, right? That they would demand all kinds of benefits that they feel like they deserve because they're part of, or they consider themselves part of, a oppressed class. So this concept, right, that critical race theory has developed, that we are essentially victims of a colonized society that we must decolonize, is tightly wound around the belief that free speech really isn't a right that deserves to be protected, right? Free speech and other rights, right, that individuals need and must have in a free society, those are not important, right? They are, in fact, Richard Delgado and Jean Stefancic write in their books that they are highly suspicious of rights. They're suspicious of the liberal agenda, as in, the true meaning of liberalism. And the different ideas. So I felt like it was important to establish that if we want to know what's going to happen in K-12 schools in the very near future, now that critical race theory has become so prevalent, they've just become so brazen about teaching the ideas, what should we expect? Well, look at what's happening on college campuses today. And I think that it's clearly a warning, and should be a warning. Now, fortunately, and I'll close with this, there are some things that can help us, right? And I think there are three big ideas that I felt like were important to explain. And I think one is that critical race theory, the idea of discrimination, it is incompatible with America's founding ideals, right? It's not the Declaration of Independence or our Constitution that are wrong. It is, in fact, the idea that discrimination did not fit with the American experiment, and so the two cannot coexist, right? The second is that during the periods in which Black Americans who were Black were under the boot of slavery and in the Jim Crow era, there were some who still were very successful, both economically as well as socially and culturally. And that's doesn't excuse the system. It means that even under those oppressive policies, that our free market system does allow for success even under the worst conditions. That is an example of American exceptionalism that we should all celebrate, right? This is an achievement, I think, of America, even at its worst, that we should say represents the persistence, that represents the rugged individualism, but also communities that adhere together to overcome discrimination. And then third, that our society is going to be defined by our cultural disposition on how we treat those with whom we disagree. It is certainly a part of the Judeo-Christian ethic that we should be prepared to forgive, if not love, our enemies and our neighbors. And that has to be something that as a culture, we have to remember, right, that this is what should define the health of communities, right, is the way in which we treat each other, but even those with whom we disagree. So those are the three big ideas I hope people can take away from my book. They're three ideas that I hope will re-energize what I think are the most precious concepts within the American dream that should be available to everyone.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan, for your discussion. And I'm going to kick things off with a few questions of my own. Let's start with this. Reading between the lines, listening between the lines, I get the sense that critical race theory is not just academic theorizing, that it's a Trojan horse for something much darker and much more dangerous than simply, well, we have these ideas and we're tossing them out there for everyone to consider. Would you agree that it's a Trojan horse for something more sinister, and perhaps you could speak to that?
Yes, and that's a great question, because those who try to defend critical race theory in the mainstream media today, they will say, well, it's just a perspective on racism in the US. It's just meant to be this view. Well, then they've got it wrong, because the original critical theorists said that their theory is based on praxis. It's based on application. It's based on action. And critical race theorists agree, right? Delgado and Stefancic and others have written that critical race theory has an activist dimension. It is meant to be applied. It's not just something to be discussed. This is something that is supposed to fuel change. And that's why, when they point back to the civil rights era, they're not just criticizing the mindset of those who are trying to achieve civil rights. They were saying that you stopped too soon at equality, right? Equality is not what you're after. Equity is what they're after, which is equal outcomes, which of course has, deeply Marxist roots, right? That is only something that can be produced by a governing culture that is trying to set prices, that is trying to determine, where you work, that sets rigid rules for all the different parts of society. So to answer your question, it is a Trojan horse, but I don't think that critical race theorists try to hide it. I think they were saying this out loud for decades, and I think it's only now that people are seeing what sort of pernicious effects that these can have. And for those who believe that we should be treated, according to our choices and our behavior, according to our character, right? To use the famous phrase. We can just point back to the original critical race theorists and say, no, this is what they said. They said it. These racist ideas must be applied.
One of the more bizarre defenses I've heard from the people who are propounding CRT is that it's just being taught in law schools. We're not shoving this down the throat of kids in schools. This is just a theory that is taught in law schools that students are free to accept or reject. And I take it that you would disagree with that it's very much in being taught in schools. Maybe they don't always use the words critical race theory, but they're using those concepts. Perhaps you could speak to this, Jonathan. How about some examples of the kinds of things that young kids, grades 1 through 6 maybe, are learning about these CRT concepts, and maybe some things that are being taught in high schools that are meant to incline young people to reject the ideas of American liberalism in its true sense, of equality under the law, and instead adopt this pernicious mindset that we must have overall control of society to make sure that all groups get equal representation, equal goods, and so forth. Could you give us some examples of sorts of things that kids are learning, are being shoved down their throats?
Well, sure. And we mentioned some earlier when I was talking about Hayward Unified School District use the words critical race theory in a message to their school community. California has intersectionality as a part of their ethnic studies model curriculum that the state created, and on and on. I talked about Virginia and Portland. I'll give you a couple of others that use the words critical race theory. I think that or intersectionality. So in Illinois, they have redrafted the state's teacher certification standards, and they have a whole section in there about intersectionality. So it is a part of how Illinois will design their teacher certification programs, will be based around the critical race theory concept of intersectionality.
Maybe flesh that out a little bit for our listeners, our viewers. What is this intersectionality concept?
So that's a great question, because critical theory inspired not only critical legal theory and critical race theory, but also certain waves of feminism, for example. And Kimberly Crenshaw is a female who is Black and a law professor, and took kind of each of those things show up in her work, right? She argues in her book, in her essay, Mapping the Margins, that there are overlapping identities of being female, being a minority. You can even choose your own gender. You can choose other identity groups that you associate with. And it's not your choices that determine your outcomes. It's not the behaviors or the way that you deal with the different circumstances that you face in life. It is the oppressive structures in society that overlap oppression onto you based on your identities, right? Based on these multiple identities. It's the intersection, right, of feminism, of race, of economics, of poverty, right? It's and gender on top of that, right? And so this is intersectionality. At that intersection is where the oppression intersects on that point. And so this means that that you can be victimized in multiple ways. And what's fascinating in her essay, she talks about how there are groups who are not intersectional, right? In particular, white males. It's impossible to be intersectional, right? There's no intersection there. They are always the ruling class who never possibly have any system in society that would oppress them, or that would be disadvantageous, right, to the life that they want to live. Whereas minorities and those who are homosexual or want to choose a different gender, right, they are always oppressed, and it's multiplied when they combine. So this, when applied to curriculum, I think very easily matches up with books by, say, you could think of and now of course the name escapes me, but Zinn, of course, Howard Zinn's book about American history, right? And his book on American history writes that America was not created by individuals who were seeking freedom and independence and looking to establish a new nation kind of based on this idea of self-governance. Rather, it was oppressing the peoples who were here. And then once the government was built, it oppressed everyone underneath of it, right? So that Zinn's idea fits very nicely with intersectionality. And so in California's ethnic studies program, they recommend Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States, for example, right? You also have math, if you can believe it. The National Council of the Teachers of Mathematics, their keynote speaker at their 2019 conference was Gloria Ladson-Billings, who was a professor emeritus at Wisconsin, who's a critical race theorist. She wrote an essay called Just What is Critical Race Theory and What is it doing in a nice field like education? And talks about how the curriculum in schools is part of an oppressive master script that America, has laid down on top of students. So one more quick example from math is in California. There's a math curriculum that was developed by some district leaders from LA, San Diego, and elsewhere, funded by the Gates Foundation, and it's called Equitable Math. And it says that in the teacher manuals, it says that math is an element of white supremacy, right? We need to teach math because the whole purpose is to help students overcome white supremacy, and also to criticize capitalism, and on and on. I mean, the path weaves its way from victimization to Marx to racism and back again. And you're in this sort of infinite loop of discrimination, of victimhood, of oppression, without ever saying to students, look, the American dream belongs to all of us. The purpose, right, of government is to remove the obstacles that keep people from human flourishing. That's a big part of why we elect, our officials. That's something that is lost in critical race theory.
I have heard of instances where lesson plans involve something like this. Students are told to separate according to their races, and white kids are told that they are oppressors, and it's quite socially damaging, psychologically damaging to them. And parents have been complaining about this, that they don't like it when their kids come home in tears after being told that they're part of an oppressor class, and they have racist feelings which cannot be ever expunged, that they're just inherently bad people. So aren't parents starting to get a sense that this is really a waste, not just a waste of time, but really psychologically bad? And is there a counter-revolution brewing here?
Unfortunately, yes. And I think that's what really should encourage all of us. I think that there are some terrific groups. I mentioned Parents Defending Education is one, Moms for Liberty is another. And these are groups now who are saying to parents, look, you don't have to take this sitting down. And we've seen from the parents speaking up at school board meetings that many are not willing to just abide by what is being foisted on them by the so-called elite. Mm-hmm. And if there was ever better evidence than last fall, when the National School Boards Association called on the Biden administration to treat parents like terrorists. That's the evidence, right? The established institution recognized that parents were objecting to this dogma of identity politics, and so that should encourage all of us. And it should also encourage us that shortly after the School Board Association released that message to the White House, and then the White House said that they would be following it up with further action by the FBI. And then we found, investigators found that there was collusion between the School Board Association and the White House, that the National School Board Association lost about half their members. And so, someone said recently that they should really just be called the Regional School Board Association because they've lost so many members. I mean, this is how the American public feels about these issues. And surveys demonstrate this, right? Parents Defending Education had a survey last year that showed upward of 70% of parents objected to the idea that children should be treated differently based on skin color. A Heritage Foundation survey from 2 years ago asked parents what they felt about the teaching of history and slavery in particular. And upwards of 80% said that they believed that slavery was a stain. It was a tragedy that happened, but it does not define America going forward. And that's an important concept, right? Because that's the opposite of what the 1619 Project is trying to do. The 1619 Project claims that slavery defines us now and defines us going forward, right? They're trying to flip the narrative and say, we never left slavery behind. It will always be a part of the American experience, which is why it's so important to understand Derek Bell's idea that discrimination is woven into the American fabric, right? We can never get away from it. And so you're creating this perfect trap where you can never get away from discrimination in the United States, right? There's no escape. There's no nothing to look forward to. There's no positive outcome here, which is why it is so devastating, like you described, to teach this to young people.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll turn it over to our viewers and listeners. What do you think state policy makers can do? What should they do to combat this scourge that is creeping all over our education system?
So I think from the state level, I think that policymakers can say that no individual, so no teacher or student, should be compelled to affirm or profess or believe any idea, really, but especially ideas that violate the Civil Rights Act of 1964, such as America is systemically racist, or individuals should receive additional benefits or sanctions based on the color of their skin, right? So these whiteness studies programs, this how to be an anti-racist idea that discrimination is necessary because of past discrimination, or present discrimination is necessary because of past discrimination, all of that kind of thing. You cannot compel someone to believe or support those ideas. So that's one, right? You can prohibit compelled speech. I think from the school board level, I think that school boards should continue to engage in what they have really done since the beginning of public education in the United States, and that is look very carefully at what is being taught in classrooms, that they should make sure that what is being taught is a reflection of their communities, right? If parents want students to read difficult material, age appropriate, of course, but difficult material talking about the failures of America to live up to its promise, while at the same time learning about those founding fathers and those events that demonstrated an effort to live up to our promise, okay. If parents say, no, look, we believe that first grade, second grade is too young to be talking about the terrible acts that were committed onto Frederick Douglass, for example, okay, we'll save that for middle school and high school, right? I mean, I think that there's some very basic questions of age appropriate material for different students, and this is the job of school boards. I mean, this is where this I believe proper role of determining how public policy and culture can still be the place that public schools represent both, right, at the same time.
Good. Well, I think we have a few questions queued up, and if I'm not mistaken, I click on this icon, and here we go. First question is from Alex Wolf, who says, excellent presentation. My question, could there be any harmony between CRT ideology and liberal arts? Many of us know about recently popular books in high schools like The Hate You Give and Lawn Boy. Is it the AP English teacher's role to tell students that Shakespeare and Dickens are more educational than books that are talked about more often have more buzz in the present day?
So that's a very good question. Interesting. One of the things that I write about in my book is this movement that has its own hashtag. It's hashtag disrupt texts, which is clearly a critical race theory application that says that you should replace Shakespeare, Homer, even To Kill a Mockingbird with the examples of some of those books like The Hate You Give and Stamped by Kendi, etc. So it's an effort to decolonize, right, the Western canon. So is there a way to harmonize the two? I don't believe that you can harmonize critical race theory and all its components with anything that is true to the American experiment. I mean, Duncan Kennedy, who's a Harvard law professor and one of the original critical legal theorists, he said the purpose of critical legal theory is to take apart American law, either piece by piece or all at once. I mean, that is the ultimate aim here of these critical ideas, of these critical theories. Now, does that mean that we can't talk about racism or slavery or Jim Crow? No, of course that's not what it means, right? We have to talk about the ways in which we failed to live up to what our original ideals were, right? Of course we have to talk about Frederick Douglass's experience. It's so essential to understand how things went wrong so that we can never go back to that. While at the same time, I think that there is clear evidence from history that America, even under slavery, had lessons for the rest of the world. I mean, look, Sean Wilentz, the professor at Princeton, writes in his book, No Property in Man, that Benjamin Franklin and the Quakers, they were the first political movement, the first organized political movement against slavery, even around 1800. I mean, these are things that are essential for us to understand, that that there were the very seeds against an institution that had existed for millennia, and sadly even exists in some parts of the world today in slavery, right? So it's not about banning books, right? We shouldn't be coming up with books to ban. We should, though, be deciding what are the key skills, the key information that we want students to learn, and how do we make sure that that material is emphasized, is the focus of our K-12 experience.
Very good. Oh, here's another question. What is the role of teacher certification standards in all of this?
Well, I think it has a key role. As we can see from Illinois, they've worked in some of these discriminatory ideas into the teacher certification process. And a colleague of mine at the Heritage Foundation, Lindsay Burke, has done some tremendous research on colleges of education and the amount of attention that those colleges spend on critical race theory. Look, Paulo Freire, the Brazilian Marxist, his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, is still one of the most cited books in colleges of education today. Not to mention a handful of other, critical race theory books. So, I think that we should be. I think the shortest way, I think, to get to the solution here is to say that qualified professionals should be able to enter the workforce without having to go back through the process of going to a college of education or taking a praxis test or something like that, right? I think that we should be changing up the whole concept of what makes a good teacher, because the evidence shows that there is no relationship between whether or not a teacher went through a college of education and whether they are an effective teacher in terms of student outcomes later. There's been great research by the Brookings Institution in particular on that.
Very good. It's a topic that I've also addressed from time to time, teacher certification standards. We might be better off if the state just bowed out and let the schools choose the teachers who they think are really competent and well-informed without making them go through the certification, which seems to do much more harm than good.
Well, and it's not a crazy idea, right? I mean, charter schools are the fastest growing sector of the public school landscape. And charter schools in most states, they don't have to have all of their teachers certified. They can hire teachers who are not certified. And that's, this is a step towards giving schools more autonomy over how they believe that they should operate.
Once I asked the headmaster of a private academy what he thought about hiring teachers who didn't have their certifications and didn't have national board credentials and so forth. He said, I try not to hold those things against them, but what I'm always looking for are people who are passionate about teaching and really know a subject.
Yes.
Here's another question. Is CRT a challenge only at some American institutions, or is it also impacting on other countries? For example, South Africa, with the idea of academic freedom and the idea of decolonizing the higher education curriculum. How about that?
I'm not aware of what's happened in many other countries, although I would say that there has been resistance to the ideas of critical race theory in England. I think that there has been even statements put out by government officials in England regarding equality under the law and reaffirming this idea that people should not be treated differently just based on skin color. But I don't know how it has been handled in other nations, especially. It would be interesting to know how it has been dealt with, especially in countries like South Africa that have a past that has, clearly a very dark, history of racism.
Yes. Another question. An ideology provides the answer to all questions. An ideology would get no toehold if it didn't contain some element of truth. Lately, we see that ideologues have no interest in reason nor in changing. CRT seems to be a zero-sum power game. You have, we demand. What's your take on that, Jonathan?
I think that the strongest argument that critical race theorists try to make is that there are different outcomes for people in different situations, different socioeconomic circumstances in the United States. The free market capitalist system produces different outcomes. Now, the critical race theorists will say that this is a bug, not a feature of the system. And they say that the system should produce equal outcomes. And, as we've talked about here, it is actually a feature because what it allows is for people to improve their station in life, right? If you have a government that creates equal outcomes, that means they're not going to allow people to improve their station in life, right? That's the whole point of what makes capitalism superior, to other economic systems. What makes our representative system has a self-correcting mechanism that when a policy goes awry, we can vote to change those who represent us and the system so that it allows us to improve our station in life. So I think that, if there was a kernel of truth in critical race theory, it would be this argument that while, yes, we are not all born into the same situation. We do, though, have the freedom and the opportunity to improve on where we started. And I think, again, this is like what we were saying a moment ago. I mean, this is why the American experiment is so profound, is that our objective should be to make sure that any obstacles to human flourishing, to human achievement, to improving your station in life are removed, right? And that government does not add new ones to it.
Picking up on a further point in that last question, namely the way that CRT advocates seem to reject reason, it makes it almost impossible to debate them. In fact, I know of cases where CRT advocates like Ibram X. Kendi have been challenged to debate, and they simply will not do so. And if anyone dares to challenge CRT ideas, they're apt to get, as the expression now goes, canceled. They'll be shouted down. There'll be demands that these, if they're on the faculty, that they be fired. Instead of trying to make their case with reason, they try to make their case with force and with browbeating.
With power, yeah.
With power, exactly, which is very similar to the way the Marxists always behaved. They didn't want to debate whether Marx was right or not. If you disagreed with him, you were a class enemy, and that was the end of it. Aren't we seeing much the same thing here?
Well, the problem with Marxism and communism is that it just hasn't been done right yet, right? I mean, we just need it to be applied correctly, and then we'll see, the true Marxism and communism. That's nonsense, of course. I think that one of the ways that we can provide evidence to this concept that they're not really interested in debate or discourse is Ibram Kendi wrote an essay for, I think it was Politico just a couple of years ago, that said that there should be a federal department of anti-racism, and through that department, every local, state, and federal policy must be put through some sort of blender or evaluation process to see how it holds up to the anti-racist ideals, right? So he's not interested in, the different levels of government. He's not interested in this idea that we have, federal officials, we have state legislatures, we have, city council, things like that. No, there's not different layers of government. Everything must be run through this one federal agency that knows all about anti-racism, and we have to judge everything according to some sort of anti-racist barometer, whereby capitalism and racism are conjoined twins, which are also in Kendi's words. I mean, there's no room for debate, right? You're just going to create an office that tells all of us whether we're racist or not.
Well, here's another suggestion. One viewer writes, why not use the Arizona idea of complete K-12 choice? to foster more variety in schools by unrestricted vouchers. What do you say to that, Jonathan?
So I was so pleased to be at the Goldwater Institute when education savings accounts first became law in 2011, and it was really a pleasure to watch that program develop and grow. It started as in the fall of 2011, you had 75 children with special needs using these account style school choice options, and today you have thousands of children across Arizona, Florida, Mississippi, Tennessee, North Carolina, and soon Missouri and Kentucky, West Virginia. And what happens is that the state deposits a portion of a child's funds in a private bank style account that parents use to buy education products and services for their children. And so just a couple of weeks ago, Governor Doug Ducey expanded Arizona's education savings account so that every child in the state can apply for an account. And families can pay for textbooks, online classes, they can pay private school tuition, they can save money from year to year, they can hire a personal tutor, pay for educational therapies. I mean, it's really just a fascinating way to customize a child's education or pay private school tuition and only that. I mean, it's really allows families to determine their child's needs and to provide a K-12 experience accordingly. So I think this is the future of education. I mean, this is, when state lawmakers today are talk about how to create more opportunities, they are talking about education savings accounts. I mean, it's not just a scholarship anymore. This is a account style system that allows families multiple choices all at once. So it's very exciting. West Virginia also has a very expansive law. Florida as well. Florida has some upwards of 20,000 children using education savings accounts there. So I think that it's very exciting. And look, Texas Governor Greg Abbott has said that he is keen to see a solution like this for Texas when the legislature goes back into session next year. Governor of Iowa has said the same. So we should be optimistic about the future of school choice in the United States.
That's a very good point. We should be optimistic. Let's hope that these ideas are not squelched by the education blob, which would like to maintain its monopoly for as long as possible. Well, here's another question. How should faculty members in higher education work to resist and overcome the repressive tolerance that we are experiencing?
Yeah, and that is a hard question. I mean, I think that as my colleague at Heritage, Jay Green, has found, there's an average of something like just under 50 employees at schools in the Power Five athletic conferences whose sole job is to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. They're all DEI staff. The examples of bias response teams at places like Michigan and recently at the University of Arizona, it's very troubling. So, I think that my suggestion, I think, is that we need to rebuild the system. I think we need to rebuild institutions from scratch, new institutions built around the idea that free speech is essential to the college experience, that it is not a university's job to protect individual students from ideas with which they disagree. This is something that the University of Austin, which will be starting up here in a few years, has embraced. There's a new small college, Thales College in North Carolina, built around a very similar idea with an affordable model, with a tuition figures that are much more within reason than what most of the Ivy League schools are charging today. So I think we need to rebuild it. I think we need to build new institutions, and I think there's an appetite for it. We were just prior to our presentation here, we were talking about the amount of faculty and donor interest at University of Austin when they announced that they were opening. There was pretty significant interest from professors and from the charitable sector. They're looking for new schools that are going to try to restore the promise of the pursuit of truth in higher ed.
So the sad fact is that for professors who are caught or stuck in institutions where they have to walk on eggshells no matter to make sure that they don't offend anyone and are not called out, they probably just have to bide with it until such time as new institutions arise where their ideas will be welcomed and they won't have to worry about saying things that someone finds offensive.
Well, I think there are institutions out there that are helping to defend academics who want to protect their free speech rights. I mean, the Goldwater Institute I've talked about already. There's a group called Speech First that has had some pretty significant victories over at the University of Michigan. They were able to get Michigan to disband its bias response team. Southeastern Legal Foundation is another that has been active in this legal space. I mean, I think there are groups out there that are prepared to defend professors who are, believe that free speech, means that we should be able to listen and be heard on college campuses. So, it's not an impossible situation today, but it is certainly challenging. It is certainly challenging.
Yes, it is, and it takes some intestinal fortitude to fight the power, because if you say the wrong things, you're likely to be out of a job, or the power system in our schools, and especially in colleges, will make life so miserable for you for so long that even if you think you have a good chance eventually winning with the likes of fire behind you or speech first, is it worth all that turmoil? For a lot of people, they'll say, no, the better course is just to keep my mouth shut, unfortunately. Let me ask you this question, Jonathan. Should people have to go to education school and get a degree before they can become a teacher?
No, I think that teacher certification, as well as the accreditation process for K-12 schools, are two of the big institutions that are in desperate need of change. I think they are outdated now, and I think that they are dominated by a couple of institutions, by a couple of groups that dictate really the outcomes or the results of teacher training programs. And I'm referring here to some of the large education schools, as well as the credentialing procedures. So, as we were discussing just a few minutes ago, I think that states should consider policies that allow competent professionals, to leave their job and enter the teaching profession if they can demonstrate success, if they can demonstrate that they can help students learn. I mean, I think that teachers should be judged based on their outcomes. I mean, there are clearly obvious things that we should make sure around safety, right? That schools adhere to, background checks and all of that kind of thing. But, within the bounds of those kind of reasonable provisions, we should still be saying that a competent engineer should be able to teach math. A competent computer programmer should be able to teach computer programming in school. A Spanish speaker should be able to teach Spanish in a school, as long as they can demonstrate, right, that they know how to help students succeed and run a classroom. Again, a big part of this discussion is that the research has found that there is not any reliable evidence that just because a teacher has a certain degree or certificate or has been through a college of education, that makes them a more effective teacher.
In fact, couldn't a rather good argument be made to the contrary, that education schools impart a whole lot of mistaken ideas in the minds of teachers? I remember reading a paper years ago, I think it was Pacific Legal put this paper out, where a school principal out in inner city Los Angeles said that she just loved it when she was able to hire somebody who was not certified, because the certified people had such crazy ideas about teaching that just didn't work with the students in her school.
Yeah, and it goes back to what we were saying a moment ago, that books like Pedagogy of the Oppressed and others are still a central part of the curriculum for colleges of ed. So yeah, I think there was an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal just recently by Daniel Buck, talking about what's being promulgated from colleges of ed. I mean, I think these are systems that are teaching teacher materials and ideologies that they're passing on to students that again, like critical race theory, that are contrary to American law and certainly threatening to the idea that we should be giving students hope for the American dream.
Exactly. We have one final question. And the question is, what do you think of Professor Bruce Gilley's ideas? And I'm somewhat familiar with his circumstances. He's out of Portland State, and he's been on the firing line for having said that not everything was terrible with colonialism. Are you familiar enough with Professor Gilley, and do you want to say anything about his ideas?
I'm not, although I do know that, colonialism comes from, you can trace it back to Frantz Fanon, who was Algerian and both a psychologist as well as an academic, and his concept that we needed to decolonize, not just physically decolonize nations, but also intellectually decolonize, is a core part of critical race theory. And there was, in my book, I have an example of a teacher who wrote an op-ed for PBS saying that we need to decolonize the curriculum of K-12 schools. And the trick here is that Frantz Fanon said that decolonization is always a violent phenomenon. So he's not just saying that, we need to pick different books. I mean, there is a clear thread of revolution that runs through the whole idea.
Here's a comment. As a psychologist, I believe that teaching is best learned as an apprentice. Education schools teach questionable psychology and a warped value system. Agree or not?
No, I agree. I agree. And I think that we're starting to see this when, students come home and tell the parents what they have been learning at school, and parents react in such a way that they go to speak out at the school board, right? Or, the students themselves feel hurt.
Would you not agree that the dominance in education schools of all these left-wing so-called progressive theories is evidence that the left has been extremely successful in taking over the education system in the United States and using it to propound their ideas and stamp out any ideas to the contrary?
I think it's been, percolating through higher education, especially over the last, century. And I think that, there's always been a debate in public schools and at school boards about what should be taught. And I think that it is good that critical race theory is not going unchallenged. I mean, I think it's evidence that the system we have of a deliberative process for adopting school curriculum and allowing parents to speak out, that's the hope that we can cling to, that America does have the potential to save itself because of the way in which we allow parents to be engaged in their local systems, which is why when the National School Boards Association says parents shouldn't be allowed to speak at school boards, it's such a threatening concept.
Yes. Well, we've used up all of our questions. So, Jonathan, I'm going to thank you for your time today, and I'm going to encourage everyone to read Splintered and comment on it and tell other people about it and fight back against this the spreading threat of CRT that's ruining our education system. So thanks very much, Jonathan Butcher, and thank you all for participating in our webinar today.
Thank you.